Okay, welcome to the Reagan lecture. This is the last lecture for this unit, last lecture for the semester. Basically, the Reagan material falls under two sort of general headings. Okay. Reaganomics, and which will look at Reagan's economic policies and the way those affected the United States. And then rollback, Reagan's foreign policy, okay? And everything that happens during Reagan's foreign policy all eventually leads back to rollback. So let's get started here. What I mentioned here, the two basic principles of the Reagan administration, Reaganomics and rollback. All right. Let's start with Reaganomics. We'll do the domestic dollars and cents stuff first, and then come back and do the foreign affairs stuff. What is Reaganomics? Well, it has several components. One is to cut domestic spending. Reduce federal income tax, particularly on thank you. Oh. Particularly on top earners. Reduce the capital gains tax. The capital gains tax is a tax on the profit of the sale of stocks, bonds, precious metals, real estate, and property, which, okay, oof. State. Okay, capital gains tax. So if you sell stocks, bonds, precious metals, real estate, and property, any profit you make from that is liable to tax. And Reagan wanted to reduce that tax as part of Reaganomics. 4, reduce government regulation. 5, tighten the money supply to reduce inflation. Now, again, we've talked about inflation a lot because there was a serious inflation crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. Pop in an image real quick here. So you can see the inflation crisis that hit Gerald Ford, and then there's another one here in the late 70s. And the only way to deal with inflation is to tighten the money supply. You have to take dollars out of circulation. That is the only way to reduce inflation. Now, this had already started under the Carter administration. Paul Volcker, who had been in charge of the Federal Reserve. All right, but it's going to take a while to feel the effects of it. Okay. So cut domestic spending, reduce federal income tax, particularly on top earners, reduce regulation, reduce capital gains tax, and tighten the money supply to reduce inflation. Okay. Reagan embraced what were called supply side economics. And under supply side economics, you cut taxes on the top earners, the money saved will be reinvested downwards in new jobs and investment. And if this sounds familiar, if you're thinking this sounds like something we learned about in June, you did. But back in June, we called it trickle-down economics. Okay? And we saw how well that worked out for people in the 1920s. Okay? Reagan's supply-side economics, as admitted by one of its architects, was, again, just trickle-down economics from the 1920s. Now, this admission was not an admission that David Stockman gave 20 years later. In fact, David Stockman, in the December 1981 issue of The Atlantic, and you can find this article online, The Education of David Stockman. Stockman admitted that he had manipulated the numbers to produce desired results, or as the rest of us call it, cheated. And again, that what was being proposed in supply side economics was indeed trickle-down economics. Now, this was published. Stockman was scolded by Reagan, after which Stockman released a statement, and this is so good, I'm going to give you the exact quote here because it's just so awesome what he said. The quotes in the article were accurate, but they did not actually mean what they said. It's what Stockman came up with later, after he'd been scolded by Reagan. When Stockman crunched the numbers again without cheating, he projected that the federal deficit would triple the federal deficit would triple by 1985, and he wasn't far off. This news led to a recession by January, certainly by the spring of 1982. The U.S. economy was in a full-blown recession. Okay, David Stockman's honest projection had caused Wall Street to shit its pants. Bankruptcies were happening faster than they had happened during the last year of Reagan. Unemployment hit 9.7%. Okay. It was the highest unemployment since the Great Depression. So how did we get down to this? Okay. Because by 1983, the economy will be in economic recovery. And in fact, not only will the economy begin to recover in 1983, it will in fact finally get out of the up and down that it has been on since the 1970s. Okay. Let's move to a new. One, the tight money supply works. Okay. Inflation in 1980 stood at 13.5%. It is down to 6.2 by 1982, and in fact will continue to drop off for the rest of 1983-84. It'll pop up a little, but for the most part, it'll never get up here in the double digits the way it had in the 70s and 80s. So that tight money supply by Paul Volcker that had started with Jimmy Carter works. Okay. There's a large tax increase on gas. In fact, it's one of the largest tax increases. The oil glut, which we'll get to in a moment, federal spending on defense. I don't have a number for it, but Reagan let me look it up because I do not want to mislead you. Defense spending. Spending 80s. Defense spending 1960 through 2021. See, 1980 it was 1.43 billion. 1988 it was 309 billion. So a little over double. Reagan about doubles defense spending. So inflation's going down. That's going to bring prices down. Okay, prices on everyday consumer goods. All right. Large tax increase on gas, oil glut, federal spending on defense, because all that money the federal government is spending on defense, that's creating more jobs. Okay. Now, Reagan acolytes will tell you that the recovery began solely because of cutting taxes, that nothing else was responsible besides the cutting of taxes. However, what they won't tell you is that taxes were actually raised 7 times under the Reagan administration. There was the gasoline tax I just discussed. There was also, for the first time ever, a tax on Social Security income. No presidential administration had ever taxed Social Security. Okay, but the Reagan administration does it. The other thing is cutting social spending, or as we call it, the safety net. Okay? Closing down mental hospitals, which means basically just putting people who are mentally ill back on the streets. My favorite, cuts to the federal school lunch program. Okay. Which resulted in the reclassification of ketchup as a vegetable. Okay. So, good times. Again, the only trickling down is coming from the defense spending. Okay. This cutting taxes on the top earners, cutting capital gains tax. Well, I mean, we can compare it to the Trump tax cuts. Those didn't exactly pay for themselves, and that was even before COVID came along. Federal deficit by the time Reagan left office, actually the federal deficit by 1983 was $270.8 billion. In 1976, it had stood at a measly $70.6 billion. By the time Reagan leaves office, federal deficit will be into $1 trillion. So if the U.S. government not taking in as much money, but spending more money, well, deficits rise. We borrow heavily from Japan. Okay. Oh, yeah. I found the number for you. By 1989, when Reagan leaves office, 2.8 trillion federal deficit. Okay. But the U.S. does come out of the economic crises that had plagued it for quite some time. I saw a cartoon I wanted to put in, well, not a cartoon, a chart. No, I can't find it. Oh, shoot. A really good chart. But a lot of the trickling down is here. There's very little trickling down from here. All right. I also want to mention deregulation. Deregulation really had both positives and negatives. So let me talk about the positive first. On the one hand, it broke up monopolies, particularly phone service. Really, until 1985, until 1982, if you needed to make a long distance phone call, there was only one game in town, and that was AT&T. And deregulation broke up AT&T's stranglehold, allowing competition into long-distance service. Okay. And this is when what was called MCI, which most of you have never heard of, came along, but then also other long-distance carriers got into the game. And so you could, the thing I remember in college is you could call an 800 number that would be one of these long distance carriers, and then it would beep you through to complete the rest of your call. And so that would allow you choice, because this brought in better service, it brought in lower prices. Before competition and long distance service, if you need to make a long distance phone call, you made that sucker after 9 p.m. Unless you wanted to pay a lot of money. So that allowed competition in the long distance service. That allowed eventually more competition in the phone service, and more competition generally into telecommunications in general. The downside of deregulation so the number of industries no longer had sufficient government oversight. My favorite being typing is hard. Savings and loan. In S&L, we're only supposed to do home mortgages. Okay. That was it. That was all a savings and loan was allowed to do, were home mortgages. Okay. FDI insured, but they couldn't do anything else with home mortgages. That's it. Well, they also had to have 400 stockholders in a savings and loan. Well, eventually, Congress undid a lot of the rules and the oversight. So instead of having 4 stockholders, you could have 1 stockholder in an S&L. And if they lost all the money, well, the government paid for it all because it's all FDIC insured. So things like land swaps, this is where I would sell you a worthless piece of land for $10,000 and you sell it to me for $20,000, and I sell it to you for $40,000 and you sell it to me for $80,000, and then we just default and let the government pick up the tab. What were called back scratcher loans, where I loan you $50,000 because you're cute, you loan me $50,000 because I'm kind to animals, and then we forget to pay the loans back and they default. Well, that's what the federal government's FDIC is for, all right? By 1983, losses were at $25 billion. It's $25 billion the taxpayers are paying. By 1986, we're up to $90 billion. Lobbyists blocked any attempt at legislation to rein the S&Ls in. And so eventually, when this whole thing was finally done, the S&L deregulation cost U.S. taxpayers $370 billion. Another place where a lack of government oversight was costing taxpayers money was defense contracts. Okay. Price rigging. Okay. Ever pay $500 for a toilet seat? Ever pay $35 for a screwdriver? Well, that's called price rigging. And 50 Defense Department officials were convicted and either sent to jail or fined. So, yeah, we got a little bit more long distance, but, well, we got $500 toilet seats as well. So, kind of coming out snake eyes on that one. Let's talk about the oil glut. Well, let's talk about the Soviets. Let's move over to foreign policy. Reagan's foreign policy is rollback, okay? It's not enough to contain communism. We need to undo the gains made by communists. And we're kind of already doing this in Afghanistan already, which had started under the Carter administration. But Reagan sort of solidifies it. All right, so what are we going to do to the Soviets? Okay. Decrease Soviet access to high technology. Okay. There was a lot of technology the Soviets needed, which they could not produce, and Reagan is going to stop them from getting it from the West. The most best example, some sort of equipment the Soviets needed for natural gas extraction, and they were going to buy it from General Electric. And Reagan, who had worked for General Electric, called up Jack Welch and asked him not to sell that technology to the Soviets. So that's what I mean by decreasing Soviet access. 2, increase American defense spending, strengthen our forces. Again, 1.71 billion to 229 billion. And I think I showed you those numbers earlier. 1981-1985. This will force the Soviets to devote more of their economy to defense spending. Okay. Now, the Soviets might have been able to keep up except for the oil glut. There is an oil glut in the 1980s. Let me pull up a chart and show you. Okay. All right. Here's the price collapse. All right. And it pretty much stayed that way for quite a long time. You can see where oil prices have been climbing since 1979. That's our second oil shock. Okay. Chart this out real quick. So 1979. Oil climbs 40 per barrel. All right. And then we see it coming down, and there's a glut. Why is there a glut? A couple of things. Price controls were lifted. The United States had implemented price controls on oil in the 70s, and a lot of times it wasn't worth, if X equals how much it costs to get the oil out of the ground, and Y equals how much I can sell it for, and those numbers are too close together, well, forget it. I'm just going to leave it in the ground. Price controls were lifted, okay? So the market would be responsible for setting oil prices, not government, all right? Second, options. Natural gas, ethanol, nuclear, all right? Fuel economy rises, okay? Non-OPEC members keep pumping the oil. You can see here, OPEC, this blue line, tries to turn off the oil to raise prices. But the non-OPEC countries just keep on pumping away. And so this attempt to force prices higher doesn't work, even as demand somewhat stays even. By 1986, oil prices had simply collapsed down to here. Okay. It was, I promise you, glorious. Ever pay for gasoline with pennies? It's fucking awesome. All right. This caused a serious loss of revenue for OPEC and for the Soviet Union. So the Soviets are one of these non-OPEC production. So they kept pumping, but prices kept dropping. And some economists will see the collapse of oil prices as really the thing that finally broke the Soviet Union. Had oil prices stayed, certainly if they'd stayed high up here, the Soviets would have been doing great. Even if they'd stayed in this middle area, the Soviets might have been able to keep up. But collapsing down to here totally fried the Soviet economy. That's why they wanted to pump natural gas, and General Electric, after Reagan called Jack Welch, said they weren't going to sell them the equipment. Right. So what does this look like? So keep in mind, the Soviet Union is going to collapse, okay? But let's look at some of the other rollback before we get to the collapse of the Soviets. Let's start with Nicaragua. Back in 1979, Sandinistas who were communists, took over. I misspelled communists. And of course, Sandinista, also the name of an album by The Clash, but we're talking about these Sandinistas, okay? Not not this Sandinista, okay? These Sandinistas. Well, the Reagan administration began to fund anti-Sandinistas called the Contras. Contra is also the name of a super cool video game that was on the Nintendo. Up, up, down, down, left, right, A, B, A, B. So we started supplying the Contras. Okay, the Contras are anti-communist, and they are fighting the Sandinistas, again, who are communists. Okay. In fact, Reagan even referred to the Contras as the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. Now, I don't recall the Continental Army, led by George Washington, I don't recall them ever raping nuns or murdering priests or setting churches on fire. But maybe records are just scarce. Who knows? Anyway, as long as they're anti-communist, hey, they're going to rape some nuns, we might just look the other way. Congress tried to cut this off because Congress did not want another Vietnam. Okay. So in 1983, Congress passed the Boland Amendment. No U.S. funding to fighters in Central America. Okay. So Congress said, no, you cannot give the Contras money to fight the Sandinistas. So the CIA found another way, and this leads to the Iran-Contra scandal. The idea here, okay, initially, let's sort of roll this back a little. During the early 1980s, a lot of groups in the Middle East, like Hezbollah and the PLO and all those other guys, were snatching Americans. And so the U.S. traded weapons for hostages, which led to more hostages being taken. So eventually the U.S. stopped that. However, the U.S. decided it could still find a way to get money for the Contras. Okay. So the CIA, using a variety of dummy corporations, sells or gives weapons to Israel. There was an Israeli arms dealer. Israel sold these weapons to Iran. The money from these sales went to the CIA, through the CIA, and eventually to the Contras. Okay. So, CIA gives weapons to an Israeli arms dealer, sells the weapons to Iran. Those profits are taken funneled back through other dummy corporations to the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, the architect of this whole thing was this guy named Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who has found a second home on Fox after he got out of prison. And the whole thing might have kept going, except for a plane crash. One of the planes that was supplying the Contras crashed in El Salvador. And so this plane, which had a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of guns, was captured, as was there were 3 men on board, only one survived. I gotta look up his name. House Fresh. No. Crash this one. Hassenfuss, Eugene Hassenfuss, is flying the plane. There were 2 other on board who were killed, but they had documents that connected them directly to Oliver North. Hassenfuss also connected back to Oliver North. Now, North started shredding documents, okay? But there was one document that did not get shredded, okay? And it was a document that pretty much spelled out this here, okay? So the whole thing began to unwind. Reagan's approval rating dropped. There is an investigation by what was called the Tower Commission. John Tower, who was a senator from Texas, it's not much of a commission. It had no power to compel witnesses. It had no subpoena power, but it did find out a number of things. One was how out of touch Reagan was with his own administration. Part of this had been done on purpose, so that if they got caught, Reagan would not be in the loop the way Nixon had been. The eventual goal had been to create a CIA that would operate outside of the CIA's restrictions. So imagine a CIA that is completely unleashed from any oversight. North admitted to perjury and shredding evidence. Several people were indicted. Several people went to jail. The head of the CIA, died before he could testify. What Reagan knew, if Reagan knew, is still highly debated, because you have to take into effect Alzheimer's. Reagan's testimony was peppered with "I don't remember" and "I don't recall," and it's been speculated that Alzheimer's was already present. Reagan's own son, Ron Reagan, feels that Alzheimer's had begun to creep in as early as 1985. Now, the other Reagan son, Michael Reagan, disagrees with that. But it was shocking to see a president so far removed from what was going on inside of his own administration. Again, a lot of people went to jail. The Secretary of Defense NSA assistant directors, various other people. Some got pardons during the George H.W. Bush administration. Some served light sentences and have gone on since then. In 1985, the Soviets elected, well, let me rephrase that. The Politburo selected Mikhail Gorbachev to be the Soviet premier. The Soviets had burned through 3 premiers pretty quickly after Brezhnev had died, and then there had been 3 other guys who had come and gone pretty quickly. And so the Soviets thought, the Politburo thought maybe we should elect someone who's not already at death's door. And so Gorbachev, who was only 54 when he became Soviet premier, he was the first Soviet premier to have a college education since Lenin back in the 19-teens. Gorbachev realizes that the Soviet Union cannot go on the way it's been going on, that there have to be changes made to the Soviet Union. Now, Gorbachev did not set out to destroy the Soviet Union, but he did feel that the standard of living in the Soviets should be raised, and that the Soviet Union's political operations and certainly its military commitments needed to be scaled down. And so this leads to 2 things. One, perestroika, restructuring the Soviet economy. And what was called glasnost, or political openness, allow newspapers to be critical of the government. That hadn't gone on in the Soviet Union since World War I, to have that type of political openness, political open debate. The fact is, the Soviet economy was in dire straits. The meltdown at Chernobyl also demonstrated the rot, the paralyzation of Soviet government. If you've watched that series on HBO, Chernobyl, nobody wants to make a decision. Like all the people on the ground at Chernobyl, they want somebody above them to make the decisions because they're all terrified of what happens if they make the wrong decision. And so this sort of rot, this sort of paralysis has seeped into all of Soviet government, and Gorbachev realizes the Soviet Union desperately needs to be reformed. That means a reset with the United States. Reagan and Gorbachev will meet several times, 1985, 1986, 1987. Gorbachev once he became convinced that the U.S. would not launch first strikes against the Soviets, he began cutting the Soviet military budget and he felt if he could cut the budget, that then he could make things better domestically for the people of the Soviet Union. He also informed Eastern European nations that the Soviets would no longer support them if they have domestic unrest. And so what happened is those Eastern European nations began to collapse. The Berlin Wall came down November of 1989. This wall that had stood dividing East and West Berlin since 1961 came down. Germany is eventually reunited later on. Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia all threw off, sometimes peacefully. In Romania, not so peacefully. Romania's dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, shot on Christmas Day alongside his wife. So the Romanians were not messing around, executing someone on Jesus' birthday. And so the Soviet Union would continue to limp along until the end of 1991, when it simply ceased to exist. And it became Russia and the modern states around it. But again, a lot of that collapse of the Soviet Union, again, that thing with oil, the Soviets were badly damaged by the oil collapse. As for our friends, the Sandinistas, they were eventually voted out of office in the late 1980s. And then I think their leader, this guy named Daniel Ortega, has been in and out of political office in Nicaragua since then. Eugene Hasenfuss, still alive. All right. So that ends this class on a high note, the collapse of communist Eastern Europe. Your textbook goes a little bit further. It's going to get you into the Bush and then Clinton years, but that is the end of Unit 4 lectures. Again, your textbook goes a little further. And so that is the end of 1302. All right. So I'll get everything in order and posted. All righty.